Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, by the time you watch this, I will be in Germany. I'm on my way to Berlin tomorrow, and then I'll be heading to Dresden from there, and then on to some cities in some other nations, in Prague, Bratislava, and then finally Vienna. So I thought it would be a great time to take a look at some more study of languages. This is a great lens through which to view history, looking at how languages are connected and how that drives history. In languages, like people, have family trees. They're descended from earlier languages that are interconnected with each other. And like our family trees, they get very mixed at times. And very few of us are all of one thing anymore. And English is certainly true when it comes to that. English is what's known as a West Germanic language. And so it finds its roots in German, but it's got a lot of other things mixed in, such as Norman French and some other things as well. You've got some Danish words in there, and of course Scandinavian languages such as Icelandic and Swedish and Danish. They're all North Germanic languages, so they're still related. So we're going to take a look at the channel RobWords today, and it's the topic is English really a Germanic language? Thought this would be a really interesting topic, especially since I'll be in Germany when you're watching it. So I'll put the link down in the description. You can check it out without my commentary. Let's dive in.
This is the Germanic language family tree. And look, there's English. English has Germanic blood pulsing through its veins, and yet most of the words in our language are not Germanic. What's going on there then? How Germanic is English really? Let's find out in another RobWords.
So just in anticipating how this is going to go, I think the difference and the reason why people look at it and think, oh, English isn't really Germanic, is because of the entire words that we have for certain things. But what we have to look at is the structure of the language itself. And I think that's where we're going to find the roots that kind of underpin everything else being German.
So the first thing we need to do is to establish what we mean by a Germanic language. And to answer that, we need to go back in time, because the vast majority of the languages of Europe, and some Asian languages too, can be traced back to a single
Indo-European
ancestral language. A language spoken by a group of people probably living somewhere around the Black Sea, absolutely ages ago, like 5,000 years ago or more. We call that language Proto-Indo-European, which means earliest or original Indo-European, because its speakers would go on to spread across 2 continents, taking their way of speaking with them. However, as they dispersed over hundreds of years, the way that each disparate group spoke changed, and in differing ways, therefore creating the language families that we have today.
And you want a great sense of how quickly languages can develop in different ways. Just look at how many words are different for American English speakers versus English speakers. And how many of our words have developed differently, and how many of even our words are spelled differently. And that's just in a couple hundred years of having grown apart. Imagine over thousands of years how much languages can develop in different ways.
For example, in Southern Europe, we have the Romance languages descended from Latin, which in turn is descended from Proto-Indo-European. In Eastern Europe, we have the Slavic languages, which share a common ancestor that's descended from Proto-Indo-European.
And then you've got, what is it, Estonian, Finnish, and Hungarian that are just like out there by themselves.
And in Northern Europe, we have the Germanic languages, all of which share a common ancestor we call Proto-Germanic, which is descended from Proto-Indo-European. And in this family is English, as well as Icelandic, Swedish, Dutch, and of course, German. Now I say, of course, German, because it has to be there, doesn't it? They're the Germanic languages, aren't they? But we do need to be a bit careful here. It'd be easy to presume, I think, that German is somehow more Germanic than the other Germanic languages, or even the original Germanic language from which the others, including English, are descended.
No, because if you even look at English, English looks completely different than it did 600 or 700 years ago.
But it's not. You see, we've got ourselves in a bit of a bind in English, because we've decided to call this country that I'm standing in right now Germany, and the language most commonly spoken here German, using a word that we got from the Romans. But we also call the shared culture across Northern Europe Germanic. making the words German and Germanic very easily confused.
Right.
Now, for example, in German, no such confusion exists because though they also call that shared culture Germanic or Germanisch, they refer to their own language not as German,
Deutsch.
but as Deutsch. Now, ideally, we'd take their lead on this and stop calling Germany Germany, but call it an anglicised version of what the Germans call
Deutschland.
it. So, Dutchland, I
Dutchland.
suppose. But that would make the language, therefore, Dutch. And then what are we going to call Dutch?
And in the United States, we still have the remnants of that, right? We have a culture and a language called Pennsylvania Dutch, and what it is Pennsylvania German. It's just a corruption of that Deutsch, but it's this hybrid language between English and German kind of mixed together to form Pennsylvania Dutch.
We're going to call it Netherlandic. I don't know, it starts to get a bit messy, doesn't it? Anyway, I'm getting into all of this just to say that because a language is Germanic does not mean it is descended from German. English is not descended from German. Certainly not High German, which
They
is the
descended separately from Germanic.
proper name for the dialect of German that we commonly call just German. However, English is more closely related to German than many of the other Germanic languages because it hangs off the same branch of the Germanic language family tree alongside Dutch and Frisian and some others too. They're called the West Germanic languages, and we have this family relationship with them because of where English sprung from. You see, before English was in England, it was in continental Europe in the form of a variety of now long dead West Germanic dialects.
And the very name itself, England, comes from Angleland, which was the Angles, which were a group of people who came from Germany.
And these were spoken in the same little bit of Europe from which languages like Dutch and German would also spring. These dialects were then brought over to Britain by the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Frisians, where they combined to create a language sometimes called Anglo-Saxon, but more often these days called Old English. This is Old English, and to the modern eye and ear, it's basically gibberish. But over 1500 years or so, this is what developed into the English we speak today, and it is irrefutably Germanic. No stray French words in here, the occasional Latin word.
Right, because the French influence is going to come in when you get to 1066 with the Norman invasion, and the language of the court in England is going to be French for hundreds of years, and so that's inevitably going to infect the English. And you know, here in the United States, we have a number of other languages that creep in. We even have Native American words that get creep into things.
Because the Romans had not long left the area. But really, Old English is perhaps easier for a modern German speaker to understand than even a modern English speaker.
Yeah.
It shares the three grammatical genders that remain in German, and speakers of modern Dutch and even more so Frisian would also have a better chance of comprehending some Old English vocab than someone who only speaks modern English. Old English is a fully signed up, card-carrying member of the West Germanic language family. It's as Germanic as this German forest that I'm standing in. It was written with runes, for goodness sake.
Nice.
For the win. But if our language has changed beyond all recognition since then, to the point where we simply can't understand Old English anymore, is it possible that English is no longer so Germanic?
Probably more than we realize.
Well, it's not an unreasonable question. Here is a pie chart showing the origins of all the words in English today. And look, the majority of words are not of Germanic origin.
Right, but I still think that the way we speak those words has its origin in Germanic.
Combined Romance words from Latin and French make up the majority. However, we cannot change English's ancestry any more than you or I can change who our biological grandparents are. I can swan around in a stripy jumper and a Roman helmet, but it doesn't give me Romance DNA. English has Germanic DNA. Once more, despite its French clothing, English still shares a great deal with the other Germanic languages, and more than it does with any other languages anywhere. Sticking with vocab, let's look at the words I'm saying right now. The ones of Germanic origin are in red, and the ones from French, Latin, and elsewhere are in blue. And you can see that the vast majority of the words we actually use are Germanic, despite them being overall in the minority.
That's because the everyday language stuff, like a lot of the words that come from Latin, for example, are not words that the average person uses on a daily basis, unless you're in a medical field or in some other field where those kinds of words are being used.
Why? Because the nuts and bolts of English are
Right.
Germanic.
Yep.
It's a bit lol that Germanic itself isn't Germanic. And if we look at basic words, we see how well English fits in with all the other Germanic languages. A is for apple, and that word would be
Apfel
easily
in German.
recognizable to
Yeah.
a speaker of Icelandic, Swedish, Dutch, or any of the others. And then there are the fundamental verbs we use all the time, like to come. Look how similar they all are, although we're the odd ones out because we're the only ones who come with a C. And across English's vocabulary, there's another big...
And that, I think, is the Latin influence there, because that hard C would come from Latin.
signify that it belongs with the Germanic languages. It bears all the hallmarks of something known as Grimm's law, named after Jakob Grimm, as in the Brothers Grimm of fairy tale fame. Yes, he was a linguist as well. Grimm's law says that all the Germanic languages, via their common ancestor, went through a series of consonant shifts that made them different from other Indo-European languages and in consistent ways. P sounds became F sounds, T sounds became Th sounds, Cuz became Huz, Buzz became Puz, etc.
This is all really fascinating to me, and I know that some of you aren't nerds about language like I am, but I find this stuff so fascinating.
Shows clear signs of having been through this. For example, the P to F shift and T to Th shift are the reasons why our father is the equivalent to Latin pater. And the K to H and D to T shifts are why our heart is equivalent to Greek cardia. Latin and Greek didn't go through these uniquely Germanic shifts. However, English did. Okay, let's look at some more of those characteristics of English that make it thoroughly Germanic. One of them is that we don't have a future tense. Have you ever noticed that? We make the future tense using the present tense of other verbs. And guess what? All the other Germanic languages do the same. None of them has a future tense, unlike all of the Romance languages. Here's another one. Have you ever noticed something weird about our numbers? If you count to 20, the teens only begin at 13. Why not 1 teen and 2 teen? Well, this reflects an old system of counting that centered around counting to 12 rather than to 10. 12 is much easier to divide up than 10. Plus, our ancestors may well have been doing that thing where, you count with your thumb in the gaps between... my hands are too cold to show you. Hold on. Use your thumb to count the gaps between the joints in your fingers. You see that? What? 1, 2, 3, and there are 12 of them. Anyway, the use of that system is why we have words for 11 and 12 that are distinct from the formula
that
for
I did not
13
know.
upwards.
That's fascinating.
It isn't base 12, so to speak, because from 20 onwards, normal decimal business is resumed. But it is unlike other European counting systems, and it is Germanic. So those are a couple of ways in which English shows off its Germanic roots today, but it also often betrays that it is specifically West Germanic as opposed to North Germanic, aka Scandinavian, particularly when we use verbs like to speak. You see how German and Dutch have similar words, but...
And honestly, when I have been to the Netherlands, I know that they're different languages, but just to the ear, Dutch and German sound very similar. Obviously, with different accents and things like that, but they sound like a similar language. Whereas, even if you go to Flanders in Belgium, where they speak Flemish, which is still a dialect of Dutch, it sounds like a different language to me. But Dutch and German sound very similar.
Scandinavian languages do not. They use words that are actually related to our word tell, except for Norwegian, that is, which uses a word that's related to our word snack. Seriously. I guess it's all about opening and closing your mouth, isn't it? We do something similar when we sleep too. Sleep is rather like the other West Germanic words for the same thing, but rather different to the North Germanic words. However, let me show you one more example that rather messes with my point here, because it's going to lead us onto something really interesting. Let's take our verb take and compare it to its equivalents across the other Germanic languages. Do you notice something? all of a sudden English aligns better with the North Germanic languages,
does.
the Scandinavian languages, than it does with its siblings, the West Germanic languages.
Before he says anything, I'm just gonna jump in and assume that it's because of the Scandinavian influence. That's why we're this weird hybrid speaking English, because you have the Scandinavian influence because of the Vikings' presence in Britain.
So what's going on here? Well, now I get to talk about the next big historical event for English after the creation of Old English in England. The arrival in England of the Vikings.
Yep.
In 793, the Anglo-Saxons...
See, by understanding language, we're understanding history because we see how the two are interconnected. It's fascinating. English has this big French connection because of the Norman invasion in 1066. It has this North Germanic connection because of the Vikings. Cool stuff.
was just minding their own business when suddenly some nasty Norsemen turn up and ransack a monastery on the northeast coast. The Viking assault on Lindisfarne kicks off a series of sporadic attacks which are followed by out-and-out land grabs and the eventual colonization of a huge chunk of England by Scandinavian settlers. And these Danes, as they were often called by the Anglo-Saxons, brought with them their own language, the thoroughly North Germanic Old Norse. In the area settled by the Norsemen, the so-called Danelaw, Old Norse speakers and Old English speakers were rubbing up against one another, often in fact marrying one another.
Yeah, and we end up seeing that even in the names of towns, and we've done a whole video on looking at how England got different town names from different sources. And, the city of York is a thoroughly Norse version of the name,
it seems. And so the two languages were sometimes being spoken in the same household, and they started to influence one another, resulting in a whole load of Viking words entering into the English language. There are a lot of Old Norse-derived words in modern English. In fact, I made a whole video about it a while back. But, glorious examples are words like sky and skill and egg and
anytime you see
husband.
SK.
The Viking wind-eye became our window. And to our English shirt, we added the Scandinavian skirt. But the change also runs much deeper than just the names for things.
How about the names of our days of the week, like Wednesday?
Old Norse fundamentally changed some of our most essential verbs. It's influenced how we say who we are, because are is a borrowing from the Vikings. And to finally get back to my point here, the word take is also a borrowing from the invading Danes. So what did it replace? Well, the Old English niman, which fits in much more neatly with our West Germanic siblings. The Vikings are also responsible for all of the th pronouns, they, them, and their, which displaced Old English alternatives, meaning a sentence like, they are taking their eggs, is all Viking, baby. Oh, and that thing we do after we've finished saying everything that we have to say, when we die, well, we borrowed that word from the Scandinavians too. In fact, if we were still using our original West Germanic word for popping our clogs, we'd be describing all dying as starving. 'Tis true, look at the German and Dutch words for to die. So the upshot of all of this is that English, while being a West Germanic language, also has a
We're a big fat mutt, just mixed with all kinds of things.
Load of North Germanic vocabulary. And so far as I know, that makes it unique.
Yeah.
No other Germanic language spans the subfamilies in this way, even if you take into account that a lot of North Germanic languages have borrowed words from the West Germanic language, that is, English.
Yeah, and that's why it's helpful to think of all of this as like a family tree. Because as you descend from your family tree, there's intermarriage that happens, and so you get corruption of the bloodline, so to speak. Very few people, for example, I'm about as white as they come, but my great-grandmother was mulatto, and her grandmother was African-American, was born into slavery. But you don't see that in me, but that's a part of my ancestry now, and it's mixed into me, and it might impact things like how really thick and coarse my hair is, for example. Who knows how it kind of comes in. My biological father has blonde hair and blue eyes. do I look like a blonde-haired, blue-eyed descendant? But that's exactly who I am. And English has descended from Germanic, but it's been infected by all these other things.
So a big point of this video is kind of to say that it isn't really possible for one language to be more Germanic than another. However, the fact that it represents both existing branches of the Germanic language tree, there was a third, by the way, East Germanic, which included Gothic, but that's extinct now. I feel like that has to bolster English's Germanic credentials. But any argument that English is more Germanic than other Germanic languages falls down very quickly when you bring up words like these. These are the Germanic languages' names for what we call autumn or fall. And notice how none of the other ones call it anything similar. They all use words actually that are related to our word harvest, which is what we once
Makes a lot of sense.
Time of year. English, though, is the odd one out. Autumn is obviously not Germanic, it's a French word, but fall is a Germanic word. However, we're the only ones using it like that. Then there's another thing that separates English from the Germanic crowd, the fact that we don't have grammatical gender. We only have one word for the because we don't have masculine, feminine, or neuter nouns, but all the other Germanic languages have at least 2 grammatical genders. Except Afrikaans, which has been living outside of the neighbourhood for so long that it's lost them. Not having grammatical gender is not very Germanic, although to be fair, it's not very Romance either. Indeed, it is not very Indo-European. It really is very weird, and yet we manage. However, it may well be that the very thing about a minute ago I used to claim that English could be seen as extra Germanic is the reason why it is so un-Germanic when it comes to grammatical gender. One of the best theories we have for why English lost the masculine, feminine and neuter of Old English is that the clash of the Old English gender system with Old Norse's gender system led speakers of the new hybrid language to just call the whole
just
thing.
Like, I'm out. And I've had people in England explain to me before that when it comes to modern English and place names and things like that, is that basically it's the path of least resistance kind of thing, and that's why you have, for example, the word for the city of Leicester. It looks like when you kind of phonetically read it, it looks like Leicester, but they just went with Leicester because it just kind of cuts out all the middle stuff, and it just seems like there's a path of least resistance kind of thing going on there.
Thing off. If that's the case, I'm very glad they did. Whether or not it is, though, we know that grammatical gender definitely didn't survive the next big major event for the English language.
Vowel shift.
The arrival of
the Normans.
the Normans.
Yeah.
When William of Normandy crosses over from France and seizes the crown of England, becoming William the Conqueror in the process, that is generally taken as around the time when Old English becomes Middle English. Because a massive change happens in English, brought about by the language of the leadership of the land suddenly becoming French. A whole tranche, a huge patch.
Yeah, and it's up until, this is 1066 when William the Conqueror invades. You're looking at like the mid to late 1300s before English starts to be spoken in the court.
Of French words get absorbed into English over the few centuries where the French speakers are in charge, accounting for the majority of that. The French language influences English in lots of other ways too. However, that's for a video called How French is English, which I just so happen to have already made. But any suggestion that modern English is somehow no longer Germanic centres around what happens in the centuries after the Normans arrive and the way English is transformed by French. However, I just want to point out something that perhaps doesn't get said often enough, and that is that the French that gets brought over to England is not French like we know today. And I don't just mean that it's Old French.
And keep in mind, too, that William the Conqueror is from Normandy, which itself was Norse. It was North Germanic. And, of course, just like with what we're all talking about here, William the Conqueror, though his direct male line goes back to the Vikings, the rest of his family tree is very much French. And so by the time you get to William, he's French in culture and language, all of it. But he still has that Norse influence.
I mean that it is a specific dialect of Old French, the one spoken by the Normans. But do you know who the Normans actually were?
There we go.
Why they were called the Normans?
The Norsemen.
It's because to their neighbours on the continent, a Norman was a Northman, because they had come from the north. And where in the north? Scandinavia.
North Germanic.
The original Norman was a fella called, not Norman, but Rollo, one of the most famous Vikings of all time. And all the Norman kings, including William the Conqueror, are his descendants. So the Normans were essentially Vikings who moved to France and learned the local lingo. And what's more, that lingo had also previously been influenced by the West Germanic language of the Franks.
What a mess. What a mess.
Therefore, you can say that Norman French was a French with Germanic characteristics. That's part of the reason why some of the French words in English are noticeably different from their modern French equivalents. Modern French being primarily descended from a dialect from Paris. The best example I can think of is our word war, which is related to the modern French word for war, guerre. In fact, war and guerre are the same word, just one.
Yeah, I was going to say, because even, the French word for, or name for William in English is Guillaume. So W and G seem to be kind of connected there.
One of them has a Germanic w sound from the Normans, and the other has a distinctly Gallic g. That w-g thing is also why William is called William, not the typical
Guillaume.
French equivalent, Guillaume. Actually, interestingly, in a few more instances, we've ended up taking forms from both Frenches at different stages, giving us similar words, but with w and g versions. Warden and guardian is one example. Warranty and guarantee.
Wow,
is
okay,
another.
cool.
Anyway, my ultimate big point here is that even the French that ends up doing so much to make English seem less Germanic is a bit Germanic itself. Some of these are Germanic-tinged French words. So I hope that I've persuaded you already that English is very Germanic insofar as any language can be very Germanic. But I also want to point out that English continues to develop in a typically Germanic way.
That's interesting, too, before he gets to this, because it makes me wonder, how are we going to develop over the next couple of hundred years? And will it develop differently? Because now with the internet and the connectivity we have with the world and the way that we have the ability to be influenced by people all over the world and not just by our local community, is it going to change as much as it has?
Example, when we invent new words, we generally use a Germanic formula to do so. When we encounter a new concept, rather than innovate a completely new name for it, we'll often just smash together words we already have to make
Which is what's been done throughout history.
Compound words. It's something that German is notorious for, but we do to a less extreme extent as well. Think about words like crowdfund, clickbait, or facepalm. And the order in which we place the words we're smooshing together follows a Germanic blueprint as well, with modifiers always coming before nouns. For example, man bun or smart.
Instead of saying bun of man, like other languages might do.
Don't take that order for granted. If English had somehow over the centuries become a Romance language, as some people quite wrongly claim, a skyscraper wouldn't be a skyscraper. It'd be something like a scrape sky, like it is in French, Italian, and Spanish. Here's one more Germanic compound for you, newsletter. I have got a completely free one that you should sign up to. It's just wordy, nerdy fun once a week in your email inbox. You should check it out. And I'll see you in whatever you choose to watch next.
All right, that was really fascinating. And like I said, that's a cool way to look at history through a unique lens and to see how languages developed over time. And I'm sure he has other ones where he talks more about how Middle English became Modern English, because that happens in large part because of the Great Vowel Shift. And it's right around the time of Henry VIII that you see kind of the Modern English developing. And really fascinating stuff. If you have another one of his videos you'd like me to take a look at, or a topic related to all of this, let me know in the comment section below. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.